Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that most people in this hobby never think to ask out loud. It lives in the margins of the lore, half buried under centuries of battle reports and campaign histories, and the endless grinding noise of war. But once it surfaces in your mind, it never quite goes away. Can a space marine fall in love? Not in the abstract, not as a thought experiment, but actually, genuinely, in the canon of the setting, in the pages of the novels, and the records of the Imperium. Has one of the Emperor's chosen warriors ever looked at another living soul and felt something so profoundly, specifically human, that we could call it love? The short answer, if you've spent any real time with the lore, is complicated in a way that says a great deal about what Warhammer 40,000 actually is at its core. It is not just a war game. It is not just a backdrop for painted plastic soldiers on a foam battlefield. It is a decades-long philosophical meditation on what it costs to be human, what gets lost when we make ourselves into weapons, and whether there is any flame inside us so stubborn, so deeply buried, that even 10,000 years of war and indoctrination and genetic rewriting cannot completely snuff it out. That is what tonight's video is really about. We are going to travel through some of the most quietly devastating corners of 40K lore. We are going to sit with a young warrior from a frozen death world who lost the only person he ever loved before he even had words for what she meant to him. We are going to follow a Lunar Wolves captain through years of conversations in an armory, two sets of eyes meeting across the impossible distance between post-human and mortal, something fragile and real growing in that space. We are going to watch a chapter of warriors forge their entire identity around the idea that caring for humanity is not weakness, but strength. And we are going to descend into the red-soaked tragedy of the Blood Angels, where love and grief and madness are so deeply entangled that you cannot separate one from the others. But I want to start somewhere that might seem strange. I want to start with a question about what the 40,000 setting is actually trying to do when it includes these stories at all, because the Warhammer 40,000 universe did not have to include them. The setting could have been purely grimdark, in the way that parody grimdark is purely grimdark. Relentless, cold, without interior life. Nothing but war and suffering and the machinery of death. The darkness without the light that the darkness is dark against. It chose not to be that. The best of the Black Library writing, the novels and stories that have endured and accumulated meaning over decades of the hobby, have consistently made a different choice. They chose to put human feeling, not as a contrast to the darkness, but as something equally native to it, equally at home in the same galaxy, equally real. They chose to say, yes, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and also there is this. There is the armory conversation that runs too long. There is the memory of a girl's face that no conditioning can fully erase. There is the chapter that never stopped going home. This was not an accident. Dan Abnett, who wrote the Horus Heresy novels that established so much of the emotional vocabulary of modern 40K fiction, has spoken about the challenge and the responsibility of writing Space Marines as protagonists. They are, on paper, terrible protagonists. They are functionally invincible, operationally fearless, institutionally loyal, and biologically incapable of most of the vulnerabilities that make fictional characters relatable. The normal narrative tools for creating audience investment, the fear that the character will fail, the doubt about the character's choices, the ache of wanting that might not be fulfilled, are all stripped away or severely attenuated by the Astartes template. The solution the best authors found was not to ignore these limitations or to pretend they did not exist, but to use them. To make the gap between the Space Marine and ordinary human experience the thing the story was about, rather than something to be explained away. To approach every Astartes character with the question, given what this person is and what has been done to them, where does the humanity emerge? Not how do we make them human, but where does it come back despite everything that tried to remove it? The answer, over and over, in book after book, is here. It comes back here, in the armory, on the volcanic streets of Nocturne, in the political halls of Holy Terror, where a space wolf finds himself paying specific attention to a navigator because she is excellent and he can see it. In the black rage of a blood angel who is not insane but simply remembering, through 10,000 years of genetic transmission, what it felt like to lose someone that mattered more than the war. Love comes back, always, eventually, in the form available to it. This is the thing the 40K setting keeps saying, quietly, underneath the noise of all the bolter fire. Settle in. Let this wash over you. Pour something warm. Put on something quiet. And let me tell you about the moments in Warhammer 40,000 when somebody forgot they were supposed to have stopped feeling and felt anyway. Part 1. The architecture of numbness. What the Imperium takes from its warriors. Before we can talk about what slipped through the cracks, we need to understand what the cracks were designed to prevent. The creation of a Space Marine is one of the most thoroughly documented processes in all of 40K lore, and the more carefully you read through it, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Not because of the surgical horror of it, though there is plenty of that. Not because of the pain, the years of brutalization, the near-death experiences that are treated as routine. What makes it uncomfortable is the deliberateness of it. Someone sat down and designed this. Someone mapped out the human soul like a circuit board and said, this part stays, this part goes, this part gets redirected. A recruit is typically taken somewhere between the ages of 12 and 16. They have to be young enough that the gene seed implants will bond correctly, young enough that the body can still reshape itself around 19 or more surgical additions. By the time they are considered fully initiated brothers, they have usually been in the process for a decade or more. The person who walked through those gates as a frightened boy from a death world or a hive city gang, that person does not walk back out. Something else does. Something functionally immortal, functionally fearless, supernaturally strong, and wrapped in conditioning so deep that entire libraries of tactical knowledge have been burned directly into the neural architecture of their brain while they slept in hypnocaskets. The process is called hypno-indoctrination, and it does not merely teach, it reshapes. The Lexicanum records are clinical about this, almost admirably so in their detachment. Weapon training, tactical doctrines, subliminal obedience packages, specialist knowledge. All of it electrochemically loaded into an aspirant's brain through repeated hypnomat sessions over the years of their training. Entire lifetimes of battlefield experience imprinted into a person who has never yet fired a bolter in anger. But the indoctrination does not stop at tactics. The psychological conditioning runs parallel to the biological transformation and in many ways is just as extreme. The aspirants are taught, and when I say taught, I mean conditioned at a neurological level, deep enough that calling it mere instruction seems almost quaint, to subsume their individual identity into the brotherhood of the chapter. Their loyalty to the emperor, to their Primarch's legacy, to the Codex Astartes, or their chapter's equivalent thereof, is not a belief they choose. It is architecture. It is built into them the same way their extra organs are built into them. By the time a neophyte becomes a full battle brother, his sense of self has been restructured around duty, around the chapter, around the war. The emotional consequences of this are significant. Fear, the lore tells us, is effectively absent in a fully conditioned Astartes, not suppressed, not managed, not controlled. Gone, or at least so thoroughly redirected into aggression and tactical processing that it no longer functions the way it does in ordinary humans. The adrenaline response that in a mortal being produces paralysis or flight instead becomes fuel. The thing that should make a person run towards safety instead makes a Space Marine run toward the enemy. What happens to the other emotions is harder to pin down, and this is where the lore gets interesting. The Black Library canon is not perfectly consistent on this point, and I would argue it was never meant to be different. Authors have different philosophies about what an Astartes feels, and those differences are themselves revelatory. In some portrayals, Space Marines are cold, focused instruments with vestigial emotional responses, capable of loyalty and anger, but not of grief or longing in any form a mortal would recognize. In others, and these are generally the better books, they are something more unsettling and more human. They feel things. The feelings are simply shaped wrong, filtered through a consciousness that has been so radically altered that the emotions arrive at strange angles, expressed in unexpected ways, sometimes impossible to communicate to the ordinary humans around them. What is consistent across all of the lore, however, is this: Space Marines are not supposed to fall in love. The conditioning is specifically designed to prevent the kinds of attachment that would make a warrior hesitate. The bonds a Space Marine is permitted to form are the bonds of brotherhood, loyalty to the chapter, pride in the mission, the fierce protective instinct toward the ordinary humans they are built to defend. These are useful, these are sanctioned. Love in the romantic sense, love in the specific personal sense that ties one warrior to one individual above all the others, is treated by the structure of the Astartes program as a dangerous vulnerability. And yet the galaxy is vast, and the war is endless, and tens of thousands of years of struggle generate exceptions to every rule. The lore is littered with moments where the conditioning cracked, where something human and specific and fragile pushed its way through the architecture of the perfect soldier and bloomed briefly in the darkness. Those moments are what this video is about. There is something important to understand before we move forward, though. We are not looking for romance in the easy sense. We are not looking for Space Marines writing love letters or stealing moments in the dark or doing anything that maps directly onto the human experience of falling for someone. That would be, for the most part, law-breaking and aesthetically wrong for the setting. What we are looking for is subtler and more interesting than that. We are looking for the moments where a Space Marine notices another person in the specific way that transcends duty, where something beyond tactical assessment or protective instinct or the brotherhood of arms crosses their awareness and lodges there, bright and painful and impossible to ignore. Those moments exist, they are real parts of the lore, and they matter more than you might think. Part 2. Before the transformation. The girl named Anna. We begin on a world of ice, an endless ocean and volcanoes that split the horizon with fire. Fenris, the home of the space wolves. If you wanted to design a planet that produced warriors, Fenris would be your model and your nightmare. It is a world that kills without apology. The tectonic activity is so violent that entire continents rise and fall on timescales measured in generations. The seas are deep and full of things that have no name in any imperial taxonomy. The storms can last for months. The winter is the kind of cold that stops thinking itself, that gets into the marrow and stays. The people who survive on this world do so through a combination of extraordinary toughness, brutal social organization, and a pragmatic acceptance of violence as one of the fundamental languages of existence. Ragnar Thunderfist grew up in this world as a member of the Thunderfist tribe. He was, by any measure, exceptional, even among exceptional people. The lore tells us he was insatiably curious, physically gifted beyond his years, and possessed of the kind of charisma that draws other people toward it, the way metal filings follow a magnet. He asked too many questions. He was too bold, too eager for the edge of things. In a world where most children died before they could become adults, Ragnar had the particular character of someone who was always going to either die young or become something extraordinary. There was no quiet middle ground available to him. There was also Anna. Her name appears only briefly in the lore, specifically in the first Space Wolf novel written by William King. But in those brief appearances, she is everything. She is Ragnar's first love, not a childhood crush, not a vague attachment, but something specific and felt and real. The lore tells us that at his tribe's coming-of-age festival, in the firelit celebration that marked his passage into manhood, Ragnar received the affection of his first love. The way King writes it, even through the lens of retrospect, carries genuine warmth. This was a person who mattered to Ragnar in the way that first loves matter, disproportionately, completely, with the full terrifying force of a young heart that does not yet know how to measure itself. And then the Grimskulls came. The Grimskulls were a rival tribe, and their assault on the Thunderfist festival was the kind of violence that Fenris produced regularly, without ceremony or warning. They hit the celebration with everything they had, and the massacre that followed was thorough. Ragnar's father died. Members of his tribe were killed or enslaved. The village burned. Everything that had been the context and content of Ragnar's life until that moment was destroyed in a single night of blood and fire, and somewhere in that destruction, Anna was lost too. The lore does not dwell on this for long. It has other places to go. Ragnar's incredible fighting performance during the raid attracts the attention of the wolf priest Ranek, who had been watching, and both Ragnar and Stribbjorn, his opponent and his father's killer, are taken to train as Space Wolves aspirants. The story of Ragnar Blackmane, future Wolf Lord, and one of the great heroes of the Imperium, begins at this exact moment of absolute loss. Everything that made him the person he was is taken from him in one night. And then the Space Wolves take even the capacity to remember that loss with its full emotional weight, because the transformation that follows reshapes him at every level. But here is what makes Anna's place in the lore significant, and why she cannot simply be dismissed as a brief backstory detail. She comes back. Years later, when Ragnar has become a space marine and has seen things that make the raid on the Thunderfist festival seem almost modest by comparison, when he has fought through the training of the Fang and the brutal trials of becoming a full battle brother and the baptism by fire of his first campaigns, an enemy of chaos uses the memory of Anna to try to break him. They use her image, her face, her memory as a weapon. Because the things that chaos can weaponize against a person are always the things that person actually cares about. The fact that Anna works as a weapon tells you everything. She is still in there somehow. After all the conditioning, after all the indoctrination, after all the surgeries and the hypnomat sessions and the years of war. In the deepest organic chambers of Ragnar's memory, a girl from a Fenrisian festival still exists, still matters, still holds enough weight that an enemy could reach in and use her. Think about what that means in terms of what the Space Marine transformation actually does and does not take from a person. The conditioning was designed to prevent specific attachments from interfering with function. In Ragnar's case, it seems to have succeeded in the tactical sense. He never hesitates in battle because of her, never makes decisions driven by grief. But the memory was not erased. The feeling associated with it was not cauterized. It was buried, and it was still alive under there, and it was still capable of being reached by something patient and malevolent enough to go looking for it. There is something quietly devastating about this, if you sit with it. Ragnar does not get to grieve Anna. He does not get to process the loss of his first love, the loss of his entire world, in the way that a human being might. The transformation sweeps him forward. The war needs him. The chapter needs him. There is always another enemy, always another campaign, and the emotional architecture that got installed during his training does not really have a room for sitting with old grief and feeling it properly. So it goes under, and it stays under, and it waits. And here is the thing that the lore implies but never quite says out loud. It was Anna who taught Ragnar what it meant for a person to matter specifically. Before her, before the festival, and the warmth and the particular quality of what existed between them, Ragnar was already remarkable, gifted, brave, burning with the Fenrisian fire that would eventually make him one of the greatest warriors the Space Wolves had ever produced. But Anna made him, for the first time, aware of himself as a person who could be loved, rather than simply as a warrior who could be strong. She registered him not as a fighter, but as Ragnar, as the specific young man she wanted to be near, and that specific form of being seen did something to him that no battle had done before. This is why the memory survives the conditioning when so many others do not. The hypnomat sessions can overwrite tactical knowledge, can install behavioral patterns and philosophical frameworks and institutional loyalties over the existing architecture of a person's mind. But they cannot overwrite being seen. The experience of mattering to a specific someone, of existing in the world as more than a body and a will, this is apparently located at a depth in the human mind that the program's architects did not reach, or perhaps reached but chose not to disturb, because the experience of mattering is also the experience of having something worth fighting for, and even the most thoroughgoing conditioning program requires its subjects to have something worth fighting for. Otherwise, the warriors it produces have no bottom, no irreducible motivation, no point below which calculation stops and conviction begins. Anna is, in this reading, not simply a casualty of Ragnar's past. She is the foundation on which everything else was built. The love that was taken from him before he could name it, that the transformation buried but could not destroy. This is what gave Ragnar the capacity to be the kind of warrior he became. Not just the bravest or the most skilled or the most driven, but the kind whose bravery meant something because it was attached to something real. The kind who could stand on holy terror centuries later and find himself caring about a navigator's survival in a way that went beyond duty, because he had been taught once by a girl whose name the law barely records that caring about someone specific was possible, that it was something people did, that it was something he could do. The law does not give Aina more space than she gets. She is not in the record the way Ragnar is in the record. But the pattern she set in motion runs through everything that followed, which means she is, in a real sense, everywhere in the Space Wolf's saga, present in the quality of attention he paid to everyone who came after her. This is a pattern we will see repeated throughout the lore in different forms. The things that get taken from Space Marines before their transformation do not disappear. They calcify. They become buried shapes that the conditioning built around, not through. And sometimes, decades or centuries later, they press against the surface again, insisting on being real. Part 3. The Wolfblade Years. Learning to protect something specific. For most of his early career, Ragnar Blackmane was exactly what the Space Wolves had designed him to be. He was fast, gifted beyond what his experience should have produced, furious in the specific Fenrisian way that tends to terrify even hardened Imperial Guard veterans who fight alongside Space Wolves and think they are prepared for the experience. He was beloved by his battle brothers, respected by his officers, and eventually responsible for one of the more embarrassing moments in the chapter's history. The Spear of Russ is a sacred relic, and the circumstances under which Ragnar lost it are the kind of story that gets told as both a cautionary tale and a saga, depending on who is doing the telling. The short version is that Ragnar cast the relic through a warp gate to prevent a catastrophe, which was tactically correct and absolutely the right decision in the moment, and also meant that a priceless, irreplaceable artifact of the Space Wolves was gone. The long version involves the Thousand Suns, a stolen plot, and the kind of cascading events that tend to follow a warrior with Ragnar's particular combination of talent and impulsiveness. As punishment, he was sent to Terra to serve with the Wolfblade. The Wolfblade is one of those beautifully strange pieces of 40,000 world building that emerges from the weird institutional archaeology of the Imperium. House Belisarius is one of the great navigator houses, one of the Navy's nobility, those mutant aristocrats who bear the warp eye and the ability to guide vessels through the Empyrean, without whose strange gifts interstellar travel would be essentially impossible. Sometime in the dim past, House Belisarius and the Space Wolves forged an alliance, and part of the terms of that alliance was this: the Space Wolves would provide an honor guard to protect the house on Terra. The warriors of this guard were called the Wolfblade, and over the centuries, what had been an honor became something much more ambiguous. By the time Ragnar arrived, Being sent to the Wolfblade was understood within the chapter as a kind of exile, a place where warriors who had done something wrong, or embarrassing, or politically inconvenient, were sent to wait out the storm of their disgrace. Ragnar arrived on Terra expecting nothing. That is not entirely fair. He expected politics, intrigue, things he was poorly suited to navigate, and a prolonged test of patience. He would probably fail. What he did not expect was Gabriella. Lady Gabriella Belisarius was a navigator, which meant she was technically a mutant by the strict definitions of imperial law, though the Navis Nobilite occupied a position so critical to the functioning of the Imperium that even the most zealous adherents to orthodoxy generally kept their opinions about navigator mutations to themselves. She bore the third eye of her kind. She could look into the immaterium and navigate by its currents, a skill that was simultaneously miraculous and slowly lethal. Navigators aged quickly by the standards of their social station. The warp eye exacted its price. She was, by all the evidence in the text, formidably competent, politically sophisticated in the way that anyone who grows up in the knife-edged world of Terran aristocratic intrigue must be, and possessed of a pragmatic personal courage that Ragnar found quietly disorienting. He was used to a certain category of non-Astartes human. He was used to soldiers, to servants of the chapter, to ordinary people who experience space marines as a form of awe-inspiring phenomenon. Gabriella was technically his superior by the terms of the Wolfblade arrangement, and she carried that authority without drama, without apology, and with a matter-of-fact ease that was, to a space wolf from Fenris, genuinely unusual. The Wolfblade novel by William King follows their dynamic closely, and it does something interesting with the relationship. It is never romantic in an explicit sense. Neither Ragnar nor Gabriella engages in anything that would fit neatly into a conventional romance narrative. But there is something that builds between them over the course of the story, something that the text acknowledges and takes seriously, and it is more interesting than straightforward romance would have been. There is the moment when Ragnar accompanies Gabriella to a social visit with Cesare Ferracci, the head of a rival navigator house. Even through all of Ragnar's hypernaturally enhanced senses, the olfactory systems that can read emotional states from body chemistry, the visual acuity that catches micro-expressions, the tactical processor that is always running pattern analysis, Gabriella is opaque to him in a way he finds novel. She is in control at every moment. The courtly Terran world she moves through is her natural element, and watching her navigate it is like watching a master craftsperson at work. He protects her body. She navigates the environment. They function together with a complementary efficiency that surprises both of them. But there is something else happening too. Ragnar is aware of Gabriella not only as a charge to be protected, but as a specific person. He notices what she enjoys. He registers her moments of humor, the small ways she signals discomfort in a situation, the particular quality of her focus when she is working. He does not do this deliberately. It happens the way the other data his senses process happens. Automatically, continuously, compiled without his choosing to compile it. The difference is that the information about Gabriella accumulates differently than tactical intelligence. It does not stay in the combat processing layer of his awareness. It goes somewhere else. The lore does not give us a name for what Ragnar feels toward Gabriella. The lore is too honest about what Ragnar is for that. He is a space marine. He is a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. He was not built for this. Whatever he feels is filtered through conditioning so thorough that he may not himself recognize what is happening in his own internal architecture. But he saves her life at the cost of enormous personal risk, multiple times. He fights against the entire power structure of a rival navigator, house on her behalf, in a city and an environment where he has no tactical advantage and no natural home ground. He comes back for her when he could have left, when leaving would have been reasonable, when the mission as strictly defined would not have required it. And when she is threatened, when her specific survival is in question, rather than just the general success of the mission, something in his threat response spikes in a way that goes beyond professional protection. One review of the Wolfblade novel noted what it called the unspace wolf feelings that Ragnar develops around Gabriella. That phrasing is remarkably good, actually. It is not an accusation. It is an observation. Whatever Ragnar feels for Gabriella is something that his chapter's culture and his conditioning do not have adequate frameworks for, and the novel is honest about that gap. It is something that exists in the space between the categories the Astartes program built. Later, when Ragnar returns to the Space Wolves and eventually climbs to the rank of Wolf Lord, Gabriella does not follow him. The constraints of their respective worlds make that impossible. She returns to the political life of House Belisarius. He returns to Fenris and the endless war. The brief period where their lives overlapped ends, as all such periods in the grimly logical universe of 40K end, with separation. There is no clean resolution. There is no declaration. There is only the fact of what happened while it happened, and the permanent record of a space marine who learned, in the courts and corridors of Holy Terror, that he was capable of caring about someone in a way that his conditioning had not prepared him for. That matters. The Wolfblade years changed Ragnar in ways that outlasted the assignment. The youngest Wolf Lord in the history of the chapter, the warrior who would eventually face Gazkul and survive, carried something back from Terror that had not been there before. A certain specificity in how he thought about the people he was fighting to protect. A depth of investment in civilian welfare that went beyond even the Space Wolves' natural inclination toward protecting their flock. If you trace Ragnar's career through the novels, there is a quality of attention in his later leadership that was not there before the Wolfblade. A harder knowledge that the mortal people around him were not abstractions but individuals, specific and irreplaceable, worth the personal cost. Love does that. Even love that was never named, never completed, never possible in any conventional sense. It leaves a mark on the shape of a person's attention. To understand the full weight of what Terror represented for Ragnar, though, we need to sit with the strangeness of the place itself for a moment. Because Holy Terror, the throne world of the Imperium, the most sacred and most ancient and most horrifyingly overcrowded world in all of human space, is itself a character in the Wolfblade story, and the character it plays is that of a disorienting mirror. Ragnar was born on Fenris. He grew up in a world where hierarchy was visible and physical, where the strongest person in any given situation was the one who made the decisions, where social complexity was the complexity of competing strengths rather than competing agendas. The political sophistication of Terran aristocratic culture was entirely outside his experience. He had never before entered a room where the most dangerous person present was wearing the best smile. He had never before been in a situation where victory was defined not as the elimination of the enemy, but as the successful navigation of a conversation. He had never before protected someone by standing slightly back and saying nothing while that person handled threats that he could not see or touch or confront directly. This enforced passivity, this role of muscle deployed in service of someone else's intelligence operation, was its own kind of trial. And the specific quality of Ragnar's experience of it was shaped entirely by who Gabriella was. A different person in that role. Someone less direct. Someone less genuinely competent. Someone whose superiority was positional rather than earned. And Ragnar's time in the Wolfblade might have been only the frustrating assignment it was officially labeled as. What it actually became was an education, and Gabriella was both the teacher and the curriculum. The navigator houses of Terror exist in a state of permanent cold war with each other. The marriages, alliances, betrayals, and information operations that constitute the political life of the Navis Nobilite are not a background to the real business of these houses. They are the real business. The ability to navigate the warp is the navigator's fundamental power, and it is non-negotiable. The Imperium cannot function without them, but navigating the warp is a capacity that any sufficiently well-bred navigator possesses. What say, differentiates the houses from each other, what determines which of them rises and which falls, which of them supplies the High Lords of Terror with representatives, and which of them becomes a footnote. All of that is determined by the same messy, personal, human drama of politics that governs every aristocratic institution in human history. Gabriella moved through this world with the ease of someone who had been trained for it from birth, which she had. She knew which smiles to return and which to deflect. She knew which pieces of information to share and which to pocket. She knew that the proposal from House Ferracci to marry her to one of their sons was not a romantic overture, but a power play, and she knew exactly how to decline it in a way that banked the situation rather than igniting it. She was, in the vocabulary of Terran politics, excellent. And watching her be excellent, from his position slightly behind her shoulder, Ragnar found himself doing something new. He was paying attention, not the threat assessment attention that was his default mode in any environment, though that was happening too, continuously, automatically, his Astartes' enhanced senses cataloguing every person in every room for potential danger. Something else. He was paying attention to her specifically, to the choices she made and why she made them, to the quality of her judgment under pressure, to the moments where the political mask slipped briefly and something more personal showed through before being recomposed. He was building a model of her, not as a tactical asset or an institutional obligation, but as a person with the particular architecture of mind and character that made her her rather than any other navigator in the house. This is the process the conditioning was supposed to prevent, not through any specific mechanism that targets a specific prohibited activity, but through the general reorientation of a Space Marine's attention toward the mission, the chapter, the enemy. The conditioning works by making other things less salient, less worthy of sustained attention, less capable of drawing resources from the war-focused mind. What Ragnar was doing, in the corridors of House Belisarius, and the drawing rooms of the rival houses and the ancient roads of Holy Terror, was allowing something outside the military world to be salient, allowing himself to find it interesting, allowing her to matter. It is worth being precise about what the Wolfblade law does and does not claim about this relationship. William King is a careful writer, and he does not claim that Ragnar Blackmane fell in love with Gabriella Belisarius in any conventional sense. The physical reality is essentially impossible. The biological gap between Astartes and unaugmented human is so extreme that the simple mechanics of ordinary human intimacy do not really apply, and the conditioning on top of the biology makes any straightforward romantic reading of their dynamic law-breaking in a way that the text scrupulously avoids. What the text does claim is something more interesting than a conventional love story. It claims that Ragnar developed a specific investment in Gabriella's survival that went beyond duty, beyond the professional pride of a competent guardian, beyond even the intense protectiveness that the Space Wolves extend as a general cultural value toward those in their care. The investment was personal. It was about her specifically. When she was threatened, the threat registered differently than threats to other people registered. When she was in danger, something in the back of his consciousness went quiet and cold in a particular way that his battle brothers, watching from the outside, would have recognized immediately if they were prone to naming such things, which Space Wolves generally are actually, in their saga-telling way. The moment near the end of the Wolfblade narrative, when Ragnar and Gabriella are rushing toward the vaults as the Ferracci assassin, moves through the house, is one of the better action sequences in the Black Library catalogue precisely because of this. The tactical precision of Ragnar's fighting, the Space Wolves' particular combination of feral directness and centuries of battlefield instinct, is not absent. He is absolutely a warrior doing his job.
I want to pause here for a second, just me talking, no lore. This is the part of 40K that got me, not the battles, not the factions, not even the scale of it all, though all of that is incredible. It was these quiet moments where the setting admits that even its most inhuman characters are still reaching for something human. That underneath all the ceramite and the conditioning and the 10,000 years of war, somebody is still holding on to a name, still caring about a face. I grew up reading these books at an age where I didn't really have language for what I was responding to. I just knew these stories felt more real than they were supposed to. A setting this dark, this brutal, it shouldn't have made me feel things like this. And then I got older and I understood the darkness only works because there's something in it worth losing. The war only matters because somebody loves something. That's true in fiction and in real life. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
But there is something else present in the way the scene is written, a quality of urgency that is different from the urgency of a mission parameter being at risk. He is moving toward her, not toward the completion of the objective, toward her. She is fine, ultimately. They deal with the threat together, and the house survives. And Ragnar eventually goes home with the Wolfblade mission concluded, and a new sword called Frostfang as Gabriella's gift for saving the house. The sword goes with him. The relationship does not. She stays on Terra, in the world she is native to. He returns to Fenris and the Long War, carrying a blade and, somewhere below the level of official chapter record, the specific memory of a person who had changed the shape of his attention. The thing about first loves is that they teach you the category. Anna taught Ragnar that someone could be specific in a way that mattered. Gabriella taught him something complementary and different, that someone could earn his respect and his care through the quality of who they were, rather than through the bonds of prior history or tribal connection. He did not have to have grown up with her, did not have to have shared a world and a language and a childhood with her, for her to become someone whose continued existence meant something specific to him. The care grew from observation, from the sustained attention of the Wolfblade years, from watching her be competent and brave and kind in the particular way that the Terran political world made necessary and the particular way that her own character had made habitual. This is a form of love available to beings whose entire social world has been remade. It is not the first love of a tribal boy celebrating his manhood, immediate and total, and rooted in everything that had ever been familiar. It is something earned and built, assembled from specific observations over specific time, as available to a transhuman warrior as to any mortal person. It is, in some ways, the more remarkable thing, not the love that happened before the transformation, but the love that found its way into existence after it, in the teeth of everything designed to prevent it. Part 4. Garviel Loken and the woman who remembered everything. There is an armory aboard the Vengeful Spirit. In the years before everything fell apart, before the name of Horus became a wound in the galaxy rather than a glory, this armory was a place where Captain Garviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves went to maintain his equipment and think. The Astartes' relationship with their war gear is sometimes described as pious, and that word is more accurate than it might first appear. The ritual care of bolter and blade and ceramite plate is a form of meditation for a space marine, the hands moving through familiar patterns while the mind settles into whatever it needs to process. Loken used the armory the way some people use a garden or a workshop. It was where he went to be himself, in the specific, quiet sense of that phrase. Mercedes Ollerton found him there. She was a remembrancer, one of the civilian artists, writers, historians, and documentarists that the Emperor's decree had sent out with the Great Crusade fleets to chronicle the making of the Imperium. The concept was, frankly, beautiful, in the way that many things about the early Imperium were beautiful before the rot set in. The idea was that history should be recorded not only in dry military log and campaign summary, but in art, in story, in the rich and complex human language of experience. The remembrances were human, unaugmented, and they were supposed to bring something back from the edge of empire, not just victory, but meaning. Masadi was a documentarist, which in practice meant she was a writer and a journalist, equipped with neural implants that gave her perfect recall. Everything she experienced was recorded with crystalline accuracy, available for retrieval later, with none of the degradation and selective editing that normal human memory applied. This was simultaneously a professional advantage and, when things began to go badly aboard the Vengeful Spirit, a liability of the most terrible kind. But that comes later. Their initial meeting was not easy. Loken presented with this small, curious, persistent mortal woman who appeared in his armory without an appointment and immediately began asking detailed questions about his experiences in battle, did not know quite what to do with her. He was not unkind. Loken was many things, and unkind was not among them. But he was unpracticed in this kind of interaction. The Astartes generally treated the Yers, remembrancers aboard the fleet, with a mixture of mild tolerance and quiet condescension. The mortals were small and fragile and could not fully understand what they were witnessing. And the Space Marines knew this, and the knowledge shaped their interactions in the comfortable, condescending way that knowing you are superior tends to shape things. Mercedes was not particularly interested in being tolerated. She was interested in the truth, and she had decided that Loken was someone likely to give it to her honestly, which turned out to be correct. There was something about Loken that was different from most of his brothers, and it showed in the armory conversations from the start. He was willing to ask questions that most Space Marines did not ask, to hold uncertainty without immediately resolving it into tactical assessment, to sit with moral complexity rather than burning it away with the pure oxygen of absolute conviction. This made him valuable to Mercedes as a subject, because a Space Marine willing to actually think about what he was doing was a much more interesting chronicle than a Space Marine who simply did. But the armory conversations, as documented in Dan Abnett's Horus Rising, became something more than professional. Over time, through repeated visits that Mercedes was technically there for research and Loken was technically there for maintenance, they built something that neither of them had adequate language for. It was not a simple friendship, though it had many qualities of friendship. It was not a romance in any conventional form. It was, and this is where Abnett's writing is particularly careful and particularly good, a connection that the difference between their natures made extraordinary rather than ordinary. Mercedes could remember everything perfectly. She was, by the nature of her implants, a living archive of every conversation, every expression, every moment of specific human detail that she observed. She noticed things about Loken that he did not notice about himself. She watched the way he held his weapons when he was troubled versus when he was at ease. She registered the slight shifts in his voice when he was being honest versus when he was being careful. She knew when he was working through something because of how long the silence between his sentences ran. She knew him in the deep and specific way that comes only from attention sustained over time. Loken, for his part, found in Mercedes something that his world did not otherwise provide. His battle brothers were his family in the fullest sense. The bond between Astartes is one of the genuine and extraordinary things in 40K lore. Not a programmed loyalty, but a real and lived kinship forged in decades of shared danger. But Mercedes' questions took him to places that his brothers, bound by the same conditioning and the same institutional assumptions, could not reach. She asked him what he felt, not what he observed, not what he assessed, not what the tactical calculus suggested, but what he felt. And he found that he had answers, that somewhere in the deep organic layers of himself, underneath the hypnomat installations, and the biochemical reconfiguration, and the decades of military formation, there was someone who had feelings about the things he had witnessed and done, someone who had needed to talk about them for a long time, and had not previously had anyone to talk to. The chapter of Horus Rising's early arc titled Loathe and Love, which is the title of an actual chapter in the book, captures this dynamic with unusual precision. Loken notices Mercedes as a specific person, not as a mortal, not as a remembrancer, not as a data-gathering asset or an institutional obligation, as her. The particular quality of her curiosity, the way she held her writing tools, the fact that she was always honest with him, even when the honest thing was uncomfortable, and that this honesty was the thing he valued most about their conversations because it was so rare in the world he inhabited. The world of the Mournival and the fleet hierarchy was a world of careful speech and managed information, a world where what was said and what was meant drifted further apart with each passing campaign. Mercedes said what she meant. That was, to Gaviel Loken, something close to miraculous. The relationship between Loken and Mercedes exists in the lore across multiple books, sustained through the years of the heresy, and it does something that very few 40K character dynamics manage. It grows. They are not the same at the end of Horus Rising that they were at the beginning. They are not the same in the later heresy novels that they were in the first book. The time they spend together, the things they witness together, the horror they both survive, and the horror they do not survive together, all of it shapes them in the specific way that sustained closeness with another person shapes you. They become, over the years, the closest thing each of them has to a home in a universe that is systematically destroying every home they have known. When the Istvan massacre happens, Masadi survives through a combination of luck and the intervention of Iacton Cruz, a Lunar Wolf loyalist who gathers the surviving civilians from the vengeful spirit. Loken, meanwhile, fights on Istvan III and survives by the thinnest of margins, ending up half-mad in the ruins, reverting to a feral state that the Knights Errant would later rescue him from. For years, they are separated. Loken does not know if she is alive. Masadi does not know if he is alive, and yet she holds on to the belief that he survived. It is not rational belief. By any reasonable assessment of the facts available to her, Gaviel Loken should be dead. She has no evidence of his survival. What she has is the record, perfect, complete, crystalline, of everything they were to each other, and something in that record insists on being continued, refuses to accept that it ends in Istvan's fire. He does survive, eventually. The reunion, when it comes, is not the reunion of people who have been simply separated. It is the reunion of people who have both been through things that changed them fundamentally, who find in the other person the only surviving witness to who they used to be. What Loken sees in Masadi is not only the person he cared for before the world broke. It is evidence that the person he used to be, the captain of the 10th Company, who sat in the armory asking questions and finding answers in the company of someone who thought he was worth listening to, actually existed. She remembers. Perfectly. Completely. In a universe burning with revision and betrayal and the Imperium's endless appetite for rewriting its own history, Mercedes Ollerton remembered who Gaviel Loken had been. In the end, she chooses to sacrifice herself to close a demonic incursion, the manifestation of Samus, a demon with a particular history, with the people aboard the old vengeful spirit. She throws herself into a reactor shaft to deny the creature a vessel. The last thing she says to Loken is a farewell. The lore treats this moment with the gravity it deserves. There is no battlefield poetry here, no heroic speechifying. There is the fact of a woman who had spent years bearing witness to everything, using the last thing she had to protect someone she loved. What Loken does in the aftermath of this loss, the rage it produces, the reversion to the Cerberus persona, the way it strips him briefly of the careful, rational self he had rebuilt, is itself data about what Mercedes Ollerton meant to him. The reaction is disproportionate by the cold metrics of military analysis. She was a mortal. She was one civilian among countless casualties of the Horus heresy. By the logic of the perfect soldier, her loss should be processed and filed and set aside like any other tactical setback. That is not what happens. What happens, instead, is everything that 40K's best lore is about. The revelation that the transformation, the conditioning, the 10,000 implanted lessons about the supremacy of mission over feeling. None of it reached far enough down to touch what Mercedes Ollerton had become to Gaviel Loken. Whatever she was to him lived below the conditioning's floor, down in the unstructured organic depth of him that the hypnomat sessions couldn't fully access. And losing it broke something that the heresy itself had not quite broken, because the heresy had at least left him with her. This is, in miniature, the whole story of what happens when a space marine falls in love. The capacity exists. The conditioning does not destroy it. It buries it, redirects it, shapes its expression into something strange and alien and not quite what either person involved might have chosen. But it is there, and when it is finally tested, not by enemy fire or the grinding of campaigns, but by the specific vulnerability of loving someone who can be taken from you, it reveals itself to be exactly as strong and exactly as dangerous as the program's architects feared it would be. Before we leave Loken and Mercedes behind, though, there is one more dimension of their story worth sitting with, and it is the dimension that the Horus Heresy series as a whole was uniquely positioned to explore. The Great Crusade was a period of genuine idealism in 40K's history, not uncomplicated idealism. The imperial truth was its own form of coercion, and the history of the Crusade is full of atrocities committed in the name of human unity and rational progress. But there was, in the early years, something that functioned like hope. The Emperor's project was extraordinary in its scope, to reunite a fractured humanity across thousands of worlds, to end the long night that had isolated populations from each other for centuries, to build something that could actually last. The Remembrancer program was, in this context, not merely propaganda. It was an acknowledgement that history needed to be witnessed, that the things being done in this period were consequential enough to deserve the full vocabulary of human experience. Art, poetry, story, music, the whole range of modes through which humans process and transmit what they have been through. Mercedes Ollerton was, in this sense, the Crusade era's conscience, not its political conscience. That role belonged to the iterators, the philosophical missionaries, whose job was to spread the imperial truth across conquered worlds. Her conscience was something different, the conscience of experience, the insistence that what was actually happening to actual people needed to be recorded in its full emotional reality, not sanitized into the clean language of mission parameters and campaign objectives. Her presence on the vengeful spirit, her insistence on finding the human story inside the military story, was a challenge to the institutional tendency toward abstraction that Astartes culture relied on to keep its warriors functional. Loken responded to that challenge. He was unusual among his brothers in being capable of responding to it. The Mournival's role was explicitly to provide the War Master with advisors who could think outside the purely military frame, who could push back against decisions that were strategically sound, but ethically troubling. And Loken had been chosen for that role precisely because he possessed this capacity. He was a space marine who could ask what something meant, not just what it required. This is what Mercedes found in the armory, not just a subject for her documentation, a genuinely interesting mind that was working on the same questions she was working on, approaching them from an entirely different angle, finding them genuinely difficult in ways that were illuminating to witness. Their conversations were collaborative in a way that surprised both of them. She was not simply extracting information from him. She was thinking alongside him. And he was not simply submitting to an interview. He was finding that the process of articulating his experience to someone who was genuinely listening changed the experience itself, made it more real, made it more available to analysis and reflection. The intellectual quality of their connection is important to acknowledge because it is part of what makes it love rather than simply affection or professional respect. What Loken felt for Mercedes was not separate from his estimation of her intelligence and her moral seriousness. What she felt for him was not separate from her recognition of his genuine thoughtfulness. They valued each other in the full sense, not just the warmth of presence sense, but the respect for what the other is sense. This is one of the most stable foundations a connection can have, and it is the foundation that survived the Istvan massacre and the years of separation and the eventual reunion at the edge of the Solar War. When Mercedes threw herself into the reactor shaft to close the path through which Samus was manifesting, she was making a choice that expressed exactly this. She chose to be the one thing she had always been for Loken, the person whose specific action, in the specific moment that mattered, made his continued existence possible. In the armory, the action had been attention and honest questions. At the end, the action was her death. The scale was entirely different. The quality of the giving was the same. Part 5. The Salamanders and the Doctrine of Caring. Most of what we have discussed so far lives in the realm of individual exception. Ragnar was unusual for a space wolf. Loken was unusual for a lunar wolf. The love, or something like love, that each of them experienced existed in tension with their chapter's default mode of relating to humanity, slipping through gaps in conditioning that was doing its best to close them. But there is one chapter in the Adeptus, Astartes, for whom caring for humanity is not an exception. It is not a crack in the armor. It is not something that sneaks in despite the conditioning. It is the conditioning. The Salamanders are the sons of Vulcan, and Vulcan was a different kind of Primarch than most of his brothers. Let's start on Nocturne, the volcanic death world that produced the Salamanders' recruitment base and shaped their chapter culture at every level. Nocturne is, by any standard measure, genuinely terrible. It is racked by tectonic activity so extreme that large portions of the surface become uninhabitable on a cyclical basis. It is bathed in radiation from its star, at levels that would be lethal to unprotected humans if sustained. The people who live there are extraordinarily hardy as a result, dark-skinned from generations of volcanic light exposure, resourceful in the specific deep way that comes from genuinely needing to be resourceful to survive. They are, in the casual vocabulary of 40K, a tough, people on a hard world. What is unusual about Nocturne is not its difficulty. Many of the Space Marine recruitment worlds are brutal. What is unusual is what happened when Vulcan arrived there. Vulcan was the Primarch of the 18th Legion, but before he was a Primarch, he was a blacksmith. He had been separated from the Emperor during the Great Scattering of the Primarchs, and had landed on Nocturne, and he had grown up among the Nocturnian people, among their clans, and their craft traditions, and their difficult, ordinary lives. He had not been a conqueror. He had been a craftsman, a protector, someone who used what he was to shield the people around him from the worst of what the world could throw at them. When the Emperor eventually found him, Vulcan was not a warlord. He was someone who had spent years learning to care about specific people in a specific place, and who had made that care the organizing principle of his power. This personal history shaped the Salamanders in ways that went bone deep. The chapter that Vulcan forged around his own values maintained something that most chapters of the Adeptus Astartes do not: a living connection to their homeworld's people. Salamanders who have completed their transformation and joined the chapter do not simply leave Nocturne behind the way most Space Marines leave their homes behind. They maintain bonds with their families and their clans. The chapter as an institution is woven into the life of Nocturne in a way that makes it genuinely reciprocal. The Salamanders protect Nocturne with the specific knowledge of people who have people there to protect. And the people of Nocturne regard the Salamanders not with the fearful reverence that most recruitment worlds feel toward their Astartes patrons, but with something closer to familial pride. The consequences of this for how the Salamanders fight, for what they fight for what they are willing to sacrifice and what they will not sacrifice, run all the same way through their lore. Every other chapter accepts civilian casualties as an unfortunate component of warfare. The math of the Imperium is brutal and explicit. In a universe of billions of trillions, the loss of a few thousand civilians on an objective world is a rounding error against the strategic gains of a successful campaign. Most chapters do not enjoy this math, but they accept it. They have been conditioned to accept it, because the conditioning that produces effective Astartes requires the willingness to treat human life as a quantity that can be spent. The salamanders do not accept this math. They will take losses, sometimes extreme losses, to evacuate civilians from a combat zone. They will alter battle plans, sacrifice tactical advantage, delay objectives, to minimize harm to non-combatants. This is not strategic inefficiency. The salamanders are regarded as one of the more effective chapters in actual combat, capable of extraordinary punishment in close range, engagements, genuinely hard to kill, wielders of fire and flame with a specialist's precision. They are not soft, they are not weak, but their definition of a successful campaign includes a category that most chapter doctrines do not have: the survival of the people they are supposed to be protecting. This distinction, protection not as an abstract institutional mandate, but as a living, specific, personally felt obligation, is what the salamander's emotional world looks like from the outside. And when you compare it to what we have been discussing in the other cases, the parallels become interesting. Ragnar Blackmane learned to protect Gabriella Belisarius specifically, and the experience of that specific protection changed him. Garviel Loken's connection to Mercedes Oliton gave his care for humanity a face and a voice and a history, made it personal in a way that his previous understanding of the mission had never quite achieved. Both of them became more themselves, in some important sense, through the experience of caring about one person specifically enough that the care stopped being abstract. The salamanders have institutionalized this principle. They begin their chapter life on Nocturne with families, with people they grew up among, people who know their names and their histories, people who will grieve their deaths if they die. The transition into full Astartes status does not, for a salamander, sever these connections. It transforms them. The warrior becomes a guardian of the same community he grew up in, the protector made superhuman and armored and eternal, but not estranged. This means that every salamander carries, somewhere in the structure of who they are, a collection of specific human people whose faces he knows, whose importance to him is not mediated by institutional doctrine or strategic assessment, but by the direct knowledge of their value as persons. Love, distributed across an entire community and sustained across centuries, is still love. It is still the same mechanism, the recognition of specific worth in a specific other, just scaled outward and made structural rather than concentrated in a single relationship. The Hell's Reach novel by Aaron Dembski Bowden follows a Black Templars captain named Grimaldus through the horrific Third War for Armageddon, and it makes the comparison between chapters explicit through the contrast it draws between the Templars' focused, austere approach to warfare and the salamander's instinctive protectiveness. The salamanders in this story are not the focus, but they are present, and the way they move through the war, always aware of where the civilians are, always calculating around their survival, always willing to take the harder path if the harder path keeps more people alive, is the unmistakable expression of a chapter that has never been conditioned to stop caring about the specific individual in front of them. Henry Cavill, in his discussions of the Warhammer 40,000 lore and his attachment to the Salamanders chapter, identified something important when he connected his appreciation for them to the Superman archetype. Not because the Salamanders are naive or simple or without darkness. Nocturne is hard and the Salamanders carry real shadows. But because the defining quality that makes Superman interesting as a character is not invulnerability, it is the choice, made against the evidence of a universe that constantly tests that choice, to keep caring, to refuse to let the accumulation of loss and violence and disappointment erode the specific, expensive, vulnerable act of caring about people. The Salamanders made that choice into doctrine, and what we are describing when we describe the Salamanders' doctrine is a chapter that, by design, has never stopped loving humanity, formally, institutionally, at the chapter level. This is remarkable in a setting where most factions treat love as a liability, a weakness to be engineered out of anyone whose life depends on fighting effectively. The Promethean cult, the spiritual and philosophical framework within which salamanders understand their purpose, is built around the idea of the forge, the smith who takes raw material and shapes it into something useful, something beautiful, something that will outlast the making of it. Vulcan was a smith before he was a Primarch. The chapter he created sees itself in smithing terms, sees humanity as the material they are both made from and responsible for, sees their own power as a tool in service of human survival rather than a destination in itself. This framework does not allow for the casual dismissal of civilian life, because the material is the point. A smith who burns the metal is not a smith. A salamander who treats the people they protect as acceptable losses is not a salamander. To love what you are meant to protect, to hold it specific and valued and irreplaceable, this is the salamander's greatest weapon, not the flame, not the melter, not the volcanic endurance of their nocturnian gene seed. The weapon that makes them different is the love that has never been successfully conditioned out. Part 6. The Blood Angels. When the capacity to feel becomes a curse. There is another chapter that has never been successfully conditioned to stop feeling. The difference is that for the Blood Angels, this has been a source of exquisite suffering rather than strength. Sanguinius was beautiful in the way that things that will be destroyed are beautiful. The Horus Heresy literature is very deliberate about this. The great angel of the Blood Angels, Primarch of the 9th Legion, is described in terms that carry a quality of foreknowledge, as if everyone who looked at him was always slightly aware that someone this perfect could not survive what was coming. He had great white wings. He had a face of ideal proportions. He had a nobility that made even his fellow Primarchs sit differently in his presence. Atsaun, quality of grace that went beyond mere military excellence into something that the setting's vocabulary has to reach for religious language to describe. He also knew, from early in his Great Crusade career, that something was wrong with his sons. The Red Thirst, the Blood Angel's first and older curse, emerged gradually across the decades of the Crusade. The pattern was always the same: a battle brother of the 9th Legion. In the full fury of combat would tip past a threshold, and what came up from below the threshold was not a warrior anymore. It was hunger, not metaphorical hunger, but a specific, driving, almost vampiric craving for the blood of the enemy, for the wet animal reality of destruction made personal and intimate. The warriors who succumbed fully to the Red Thirst did not become less effective fighters in the short term. In some ways, they became more effective. The artificial inhibitions of training and conditioning stripped away by the thirst, their violence, given a terrifying directness. But they became unmanageable, dangerous to allies, unable to distinguish between the enemy and anything else in arm's reach. The warrior identity collapsed into something older and more terrible. Sanguinius was aware that this flaw existed in his gene seed. He searched for a cure and did not find one. He kept the secret from his brothers. This was the Crusade era, and the perception of weakness could be weaponized. And he kept it, most painfully of all, from his father the Emperor, because the fear of what the Emperor might do to a legion he considered too compromised to be useful was the worst of the available fears. He lived with the knowledge that the thing inside his sons, the thing that came from him, would eventually consume them, and he could not fix it, and he could not tell anyone. And the only thing he could do was love them enough to share their curse. This is itself a form of love. Not comfortable love, not love that makes things better, but the desperate and grieving love of someone who sees what is coming and cannot prevent it and stays anyway. When Horus slew Sanguinius at the Siege of Terror, the death left a psychic wound in the gene seed of every blood angel. Every warrior descended from Sanguinius carries, somewhere in the deep architecture of their being, the echo of their Primarch's final moments. Not a memory in the normal sense. They were not there. But a genetic memory, a psychic imprint, a ghost of emotional state preserved and encoded in the very material that makes them what they are. The rage and grief and desperate love of a being who died knowing he had failed to protect the people he had given everything to protect. This is what lives in the Blood Angel's gene seed. This is the Black Rage. When a Blood Angel succumbs to the Black Rage, they are not merely angry. They are experiencing, from the inside, the emotional state of Sanguinius in his final battle. They believe themselves to be the Great Angel. They are fighting the traitors at the Siege of Terror. They are reliving the moment when all the love and the beauty and the grace that Sanguinius had built his existence around collided with the full force of Horus's betrayal and could not survive the impact. They die, every one of them, fighting for the same thing their Primarch died for, the preservation of something worth loving in a universe that is trying very hard to destroy all of it. The Death Company, the Blood Angels who have succumbed to the Black Rage and are sent out in black armor to die fighting, is not simply an asset to be expended on the most dangerous objectives. It is the chapter's most honest expression of what they are. It is the formal acknowledgement that the capacity for profound feeling, for the specific kind of love that Sanguinius embodied and passed to his sons, is simultaneously the chapter's greatest strength and its terminal diagnosis. The Blood Angels are capable of an intensity of purpose and a depth of commitment that most chapters simply do not have access to, because they feel things more fully. They care more. Their art is more beautiful. The Blood Angels' practice of painting and sculpture is directly connected to the regulation of the red thirst, as if creativity and violence are two expressions of the same underlying intensity, and one can be used to manage the other. They fight with a passion that is literally inherited from a Primarch who loved his people so much that the grief of his death became a permanent psychic trauma in their genetics. But they are also dying. Slowly, inevitably, the floor takes more of them every generation. Commander Dante has lived for more than 1,000 years, the oldest active space marine in the Imperium, and he has spent most of that millennium watching the chapter he leads move incrementally toward its own extinction, one warrior at a time, claimed by the Black Rage or consumed by the red thirst. He seeks a cure. Corbulo, the chapter's master apothecary, has dedicated his existence to finding it. The hope that the new Primaris Blood Angels might be immune to the flaw turned out to be false. They feel it too. They always will. There is a very specific kind of grief in the Blood Angels' lore that I do not think gets discussed enough when people talk about this chapter, and it is the grief of having loved too well. The love that Sanguinius had for his sons, and for humanity, and for the beautiful idea of what the Imperium was supposed to be. This love did not fail him. He did not love less than he should have, or more than was useful, or in the wrong direction. He loved correctly, deeply, with his full capacity. And the universe, with its characteristic cold indifference to the quality of feeling brought to bear on it, destroyed the object of that love anyway. The Blood Angels carry that as a wound in their DNA. Every son of Sanguinius is, at some level, a being in mourning for something they did, not personally experience, but are nonetheless genetically obligated to feel. This is the most extreme version of what we have been tracing through this video. The capacity to love, which the Astartes program tried to excise and failed to fully remove, finding its way out through the most painful possible avenue, not through connection and growth and the cautious building of something fragile between two people who should not have been able to reach each other, but through grief, through the transmitted echo of a death that changed the galaxy. The Blood Angels fight so hard, partly because they are always, at some level below full consciousness, fighting to protect the thing that Sanguinius loved. They are carrying love for the Imperium, love for humanity, love for the memory of a Primarch who burned as brightly as anything in a setting designed to burn all lights out, and they cannot put it down. It is in their blood. Literally. There is a dimension of the Blood Angel story that often gets overlooked in discussions of the flaw, and it is the artistic one. The Blood Angels practice painting and sculpture and other fine arts in a way that is unique among the Adeptus Astartes, not as a hobby in the sense of a pleasant distraction from the main business of existence, but as a genuine practice with genuine function. The chapter's apothecarian and its spiritual leadership have both confirmed what the lore implies. The practice of art works to manage the red thirst. The creative output of a blood angel, the hours spent with a brush or a chisel or a musical instrument, is not aesthetically separate from the chapter's psychology. It is part of how they metabolize the intensity of feeling that their gene seed generates. Think about what this means. The Imperium at large, in its grimmer institutional expressions, regards art with the suspicion that ideology tends to develop toward things that are not obviously useful. Art is tolerated, sometimes encouraged, for propaganda purposes, but it is not understood as a fundamental psychological need in the way that food and oxygen are understood as fundamental biological needs. Most Space Marine chapters treat art the way they treat everything not directly related to combat readiness, as a distraction, if not a liability. The Blood Angels are structured around the recognition that feeling needs expression, and that the suppression of feeling without adequate expression is what produces the most dangerous forms of the flaw. A Blood Angel who paints is a Blood Angel who is doing something with the emotional intensity that his gene seed generates, giving it a form that is controlled and deliberate, and not destruction. The art is a kind of love letter, addressed to beauty itself, to the idea that the universe contains things worth making and preserving, to the memory of a Primarch who was himself a kind of living art. The chapters of the Blood Angels successor line that abandoned this practice, most notably the Angels Penitent, who gave up their artistic traditions as a form of penance, suffered significantly increased rates of both the Red Thirst and the Black Rage as a consequence. This is perhaps the most direct evidence in the lore that the practice of art was doing real psychological work for the Blood Angels, that the creativity was genuinely managing the feeling rather than merely decorating an otherwise functional military force. What this tells us about love in the Blood Angels' case is this: they have found a way to honor the love in their gene seed without being destroyed by it. It is not a cure. The flaw has not been resolved. The Death Company still forms. The Tower of the Lost still fills. The chapter still moves incrementally toward the day when too few warriors will remain to sustain itself. But the art is a way of saying, this feeling existed and it was real, and it deserves to be witnessed and preserved, even though the universe tried to destroy the being who first felt it. This is what love does when it cannot go where it wants to go. It finds another form. It becomes the painting on the wall of an Astarte's cell, accumulated over centuries of service, documenting in brushstroke and color the specific texture of a consciousness, too intense to contain itself in the normal formats available to it. It becomes the music that plays in the great halls of Baal during the rare periods of rest between campaigns, music that carries within it the emotional history of a chapter that has been carrying grief for 10,000 years and has never put it down. Commander Dante, the oldest Space Marine alive, and the chapter master of the Blood Angels, is a figure who deserves particular attention in this context. He has lived for more than a millennium. He has watched every person he has ever known personally age and die. He has watched generations of warriors he trained and mentored and protected fall to the floor or fall in battle. He has watched the chapter's numbers decline. He has sought the cure for the flaw with the full resources of one of the Imperium's most storied chapters, and he has not found it. And yet he continues. He has not fallen to despair, has not abandoned hope, has not become the cold and instrumental thing that a being who has lost everyone and everything might reasonably become. The lore is not entirely clear about what sustains him. His faith, his sense of duty, the sheer discipline of a warrior formed across 1,000 years of service. But there is something in the way Dante is written, in his interactions with the people around him and his stewardship of the chapter, that suggests something more than institutional function. He cares, specifically, about the Blood Angels as individuals, not just as a chapter, about the living people in front of him, not just about the abstract mission they collectively represent, about the survival of something irreplaceable in each of them, the quality of consciousness that Sanguinius's gene seed produces and that no other chapter can replicate. This is, 1,000 years in, the same love that put Sanguinius in the path of Horus at the Siege of Terra. The same love, extended across a millennium of loss, maintained against the evidence that it has not been enough and will probably never be enough. Dante's love for his chapter, for his brothers, for the idea of what the blood angels are supposed to be. This is not a lesser thing for having been sustained so long in conditions so hostile. It is, if anything, more. The love that endures is not the same thing as the love that begins. It is made out of different material, forged rather than formed, and it carries the weight of everything it has survived. Part 7. The Gaps in the Armor, a broader survey. We have followed specific stories in some depth, but the pattern they represent is broader than any of the specific cases. The lore is full of moments that do not make it into the Bassi, highlighted passages. Moments where a space marine notices something about a specific person that does not fit neatly into any approved category of interaction. These moments are not always named or developed. Sometimes they are a single line in a novel, a detail that an author included almost parenthetically, almost as if they were not sure themselves why they put it there. But when you start looking for them, you find them everywhere. There is the matter of the Salamander's individual marines who go back to Nocturne and maintain relationships with their families across the centuries of their service. This is documented and institutional, but the texture of it in the lore suggests something that goes beyond mere protocol. There are salamanders who have watched their human families age and die across multiple generations, who have attended funerals and festivals and the ordinary ceremonial markers of human time, who carry in their extended memory the faces and names of people they knew before the transformation, and people they have come to know since, across the full span of a life that the transformation has made indefinitely long. What does it feel like to outlive everyone you know, repeatedly, while maintaining the specific bonds of care that make their individual deaths genuinely grievous? The lore does not fully explore this, but it is there in the background of every salamander story, the quiet implication of what it costs to love mortals when you are no longer quite mortal yourself. There are also the cases where specific Astartes form bonds with human soldiers that go beyond simple comradeship or institutional respect. The Horus heresy literature, in particular, is full of these moments. The lunar wolves had a quality of engagement with the ordinary humans of the Great Crusade fleets that their later descendants among the sons of Horus largely lost, and the difference is visible and felt in the text. When Loken was still a captain of the 10th Company, before everything broke, there was a genuine warmth in how some members of his company related to the mortals around them. Not universal, not systematic, but real in the individual cases where it existed. Something about the early Crusade era, before the idealism began curdling, produced Astartes who were capable of genuine relationship with the human world in a way that the grimmer present of the 41st millennium tends not to. The Space Wolves, as a chapter, are worth dwelling on in this context. Their cultural inheritance from Fenris, the Viking-inflected mythology of the Long War, the traditions of saga and feasting, and the fierce familial bonds of the Warriors' Hall, gives them emotional frameworks that most chapters do not have. The Space Wolves celebrate their bonds with each other in ways that would strike many other chapters as dangerously sentimental. They tell stories, they drink, they remember the fallen, not as statistics, but as individuals, with names and deeds and the specific qualities of character that made them irreplaceable. This is not weakness by any reasonable analysis. It is exactly the kind of emotional structure that produces warriors who will die for each other without hesitation, because the person next to them is not an abstract battle brother, but Sven, who tells terrible jokes and laughs at them himself, and Ragnar, who is too reckless and too brave, and whose absence would leave a specific hole that nothing else would fill. This emotionally richer culture makes the space wolves more permeable to certain kinds of connection. Ragnar's response to Anna, his response to Gabriella, the particular intensity with which he throws himself into the protection of people he has come to value personally. These are not aberrations within the Space Wolves culture. They are expressions of it. The chapter that gave its warriors the cultural vocabulary of the Skald and the saga, that told them their feelings were worth turning into stories, that made the specific memory of individual people a value to be preserved, produced warriors for whom the specific human person was never fully abstracted away into the general category of asset or civilian. The contrast with chapters like the Black Templars or the Iron Hands is instructive here. These are chapters where the conditioning toward emotional detachment was taken to its furthest developed expression, where the standard Astartes suppression of feeling was elaborated into something close to a philosophy. The Black Templars' crusading faith is real and intense, but it is not directed at specific individuals. It is directed at the Emperor, at the institution of the Imperium, at the abstract glory of the crusade itself. The Iron Hands have the doctrine of the flesh is weak, the deliberate replacement of organic tissue with mechanical components as both practical augmentation and symbolic rejection of the vulnerabilities that meat and feeling and connection bring. These chapters do not entirely succeed in eliminating emotion. No chapter does, but they channel what remains into forms that do not look much like what we would recognize as love. The Iron Hands law is particularly interesting here because the doctrine of the flesh is weak, taken to its logical extreme, produces warriors who have essentially made a philosophical commitment to self-alienation. They are in the process of becoming less themselves, more machine, stripping away the biological substrate of emotional life, not because they have been conditioned to, but because their cultural inheritance from Ferrus Manus, their primarch, who was killed at Istvan V, has given them a framework in which the body is the problem and the machine is the solution. The grief of Ferrus Manus's death shaped the chapter the way Sanguinius's death shaped the Blood Angels, but in the opposite direction. Where the Blood Angels responded to loss by developing an even deeper capacity for feeling, the Iron Hands responded by declaring war on the feeling itself. Neither response is wrong, given the setting they inhabit. Both are tragic. The Blood Angels are drowning in emotion they cannot fully manage. The Iron Hands are slowly erasing the capacity for emotion, which is to say, they are slowly erasing themselves. Between these two poles, every other chapter finds its own balance, its own relationship with the feelings that the program tried to manage and never fully managed. The Space Wolves, as we have established, sit far toward the feeling end of this spectrum, and their culture gives their feelings culturally approved forms of expression that other chapters lack. But it is worth noting that even chapters not known for emotional expressiveness have their own quiet forms of care that surface in the lore when the right author is paying attention. The Ultramarines, for instance, are generally presented as the most codex adherent, most institutionally correct, most disciplined of the major chapters. Their emotional life is not the first thing most people think of when they think about the sons of Robut Guilliman, but the Ultramarines' care for the people of Ultramar, the group of star systems that constitute their chapter's home territory, is documented in the lore as something that goes beyond administrative responsibility. The Ultramarines have, over 10,000 years, developed something that functions like familial stewardship toward the worlds in their care. The population of Ultramar knows the Ultramarines not as the terrifying and alien warriors that most Imperial citizens experience Space Marines as being, but as figures of genuine protection, as the defenders of their specific homes, rather than generic agents of Imperial power. This produces a relationship between chapter and people that has some of the same quality as what the Salamanders have with Nocturne, though expressed in a more institutional, less personal way. There are also chapters whose bond with a single world or a single people has become so defining that it functions as a form of love in the full collective sense. The Space Wolves and Fenris have this relationship. The chapter does not merely recruit from Fenris and return there between campaigns. They are of Fenris in a deep and irreducible way, and the people of that terrible frozen world are theirs in a way that transcends any normal description of a chapter homeworld relationship. When Fenris was threatened during the War of the Fang against the Thousand Suns, the chapter fought with an intensity that went well beyond standard defensive doctrine. They were fighting for home in the specific, ancient, deeply human sense of the word. What all of these cases share is the same underlying reality. The conditioning could not completely separate the warriors from the things and people they came from. It could build new loyalties on top of the old, redirect the energy of connection toward the chapter and the mission. But the original connection, the root system that was there before the program planted anything, this persisted, foxed and altered, and sometimes expressed in ways its original form would not recognize, but persistent. Part 9. What this means. Love as proof of something. We have been following individual stories and chapter histories, but there is a pattern underneath all of them that deserves to be named directly. The question of whether a space marine can fall in love is, at its core, a question about what survives transformation. What is it that the process cannot reach? What is it that 10,000 hypnomat sessions and gene seed implantation and decades of formation in the Emperor's name cannot permanently alter? The answer the lore keeps giving in story after story, in chapter after chapter, is this: the specific. The capacity to notice a specific person and find them irreplaceable. The capacity to be changed by proximity to someone, to carry them in, the architecture of your memory in a way that is qualitatively different from the rest of the data stored there. The capacity to feel the loss of them as a wound rather than a tactical adjustment. This is not accidental. Dan Abnett and Aaron Dembski-Bowden and William King and the other writers who have reached for this territory in 40K lore are not simply sneaking romance into a setting that does not have room for it. They are doing something more interesting. They are using the extreme test case of the Space Marine, the being most systematically designed to be beyond human vulnerability, to demonstrate what it actually means to be human, to identify, through contrast, the thing that persists when everything else is stripped away. And what persists is love. Specifically, the love that takes one person in the universe as mattering more than the general abstract mass of people who also matter. The love that knows a name and a face, and the particular way that face looks when it's on. Owner is trying not to show that something is difficult. The love that constitutes a home, not in the geographic sense, but in the relational sense. The love that makes one place or one person the place you return to in your mind when the noise of everything else gets too loud. This is what the Astartes program is most afraid of, and most consistently unable to prevent, and most unable to afford to prevent. Because without this specific love, without Ragnar's memory of Anna, without Loken's armory conversations, without the Salamander's bond with Nocturne's families, without the Blood Angels' genetic inheritance of their Primarch's grief, the Space Marines would not be warriors who fight to protect something real. They would be weapons. Excellent weapons, certainly. Weapons of unprecedented sophistication and power, but weapons without a target that means anything, without a reason that goes all the way down. The conditioning tries to replace this specific love with an abstract devotion, the Emperor, the Imperium, humanity as a category. These are real and they are powerful, and they motivate genuinely, but they are not enough on their own, and the lore knows this. The chapters that do the most good, the ones whose protection of the human worlds they steward is most complete, most sustained, most genuinely protective rather than strategically adequate, are the ones who have preserved some connection to the specific. The Salamanders, who still know their families. The Space Wolves, who still tell each other's stories. The individuals like Loken and Ragnar, who found, in one person's specific existence, a reason that went below the institutional loyalty and into something older and harder to condition away. There is also something worth noting about what the stories tell us from the other direction, from the perspective of the mortals who find themselves the object of an Astartes' specific attention. Mercedes Oleton chose to keep coming back to the armory. She had access to other sources, other subjects, other members of the Lunar Wolves who were more conventional in their interactions and would have been easier to manage professionally. She kept coming back to Loken. She kept asking him the questions that went below the tactical and the institutional. She kept staying in the conversations after the interview portion had technically ended. She was, in her own way, falling for something. Not for Loken as a potential partner in any conventional sense, because the biology and the conditioning and the nature of what he was made that essentially impossible. But for Loken as a mind, a consciousness, a being who was thinking thoughts that she found valuable to think alongside. Her perfect memory preserved him with a specificity that went beyond professional documentation. She chose to remember him in the full texture of his personhood, and that choice was itself an act of love. The relationship between Ragnar and Gabriella has the same quality of mutuality, even in its institutional asymmetry. She is his superior, technically, by the terms of the Wolfblade arrangement. He is her protector by the same terms. But what actually develops between them in the courts and corridors of Holy Terror is something that neither of their roles requires. A genuine respect for the specific quality of the other's mind and judgment, a willingness to be influenced, a tendency to seek out the other's company beyond the requirements of the mission. These are the recognizable patterns of human connection, developing in the gaps between two people who were not supposed to develop that kind of connection. There is also the question of what these stories say about the purpose of love in conditions of extreme danger, because all of the cases we have examined involve people in situations of genuine existential risk, where the possibility of loss is not hypothetical, but immediate and constant. In psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon. People in situations of shared danger develop strong bonds much more quickly than people in ordinary circumstances. The threat to survival, the need for cooperation, the heightened awareness of mortality, all of these collapse the normal social distances and produce intimacy faster than any conventional social process. This is not specific to romantic love. It applies to friendship, to the deep bonds of veterans, to the specific quality of relationship that forms between people who have watched each other survive terrible things. For Space Marines, war is the constant. They are always in situations of heightened stakes, always in the environment that produces strong bonds faster than ordinary life does. The puzzle is not that some of them develop specific, intense connections to particular people. The puzzle is that the conditioning keeps any of them from developing such connections, most of the time, because the environment is exactly the kind of environment that produces them. What this means is that the love stories in 40K are not violations of the military world they occur in. They are, in some ways, its most natural product. The same intensity that makes Space Marines so formidable in battle, the focus, the willingness to commit completely, the inability to do anything halfway, also makes them capable of loving with an intensity that most unaugmented humans could not sustain. When an Astartes is fully present with another person, when the conditioning has, for whatever reason, failed to keep them at the institutional arm's length the program requires, the quality of that presence is extraordinary, complete. The full force of a consciousness engineered for extremity, turned toward one specific person. For the people on the receiving end of that attention, it must be a remarkable thing to experience. Mercedes Oleton, who spent her professional life extracting testimony from the famous and the powerful, who had the perfect memory to document everything and the intelligence to understand what she was documenting, chose to keep coming back to Loken's armory. Whatever she felt when she was there, in the specific quality of his attention, when he was actually talking to her rather than managing her, was enough to bring her back across the months and years of the crusade. That is a form of evidence, imprecise but unmistakable, about what it is like to be loved by a space marine who cannot quite name what he is doing but is doing it anyway. The 40,000 setting, for all its darkness, is full of this. Full of the small, stubborn, practically useless moments where two people who should, by the logic of their world, be interchangeable components of an enormous institutional machine, instead become specific and irreplaceable to each other. It is, I would argue, the thing that makes the setting actually worth the emotional investment it asks for. Not the cool factions, not the intricacy of the lore, not the jaw-dropping scale of the conflict. Those are the clothes the story wears. What the story is actually about, underneath all of it, is this. In the grimest darkness imaginable, love still happens. People still find each other specific. The thing that the universe most wants to eliminate, the conviction that this one person matters more than the sum of strategic calculations can account for, keeps coming back, keeps being real. The final thing worth saying in this section is something that the lore itself only rarely states directly, but that runs through all of the stories we have been tracing. Love, in the 40K setting, is dangerous. Not in the conventional romantic narrative sense of danger, not the danger of heartbreak or social disapproval or the usual risk categories that come with human romantic vulnerability. Dangerous in a more specific sense. Love gives the enemies of the Imperium a lever. The Chaos powers, in particular, are experts at finding what people love and using it against them. The memory of Anna was used to try to break Ragnar. The connection between Loken and Mercedes was exploited by the demon Samus as a vector for manifesting at the Siege of Terra. The love a space marine has for his chapter, his Primarch's memory, his world, his brothers. All of these are things that Chaos can corrupt, invert, weaponize. The darkness of the 41st Millennium is not indifferent to love. It hunts it. It specializes in finding the thing you love and showing you what it looks like broken. This is the final reason the Astartes program tried to condition love away. Not primarily because love makes warriors hesitate in battle, though it can, but because love gives the enemy something to work with. A warrior who loves nothing and nobody is, from the perspective of Chaos corruption, a much harder target. There is no lever. There is nothing to invert, nothing to taint, nothing to use. A space marine who has successfully been made into a pure weapon has, in this one specific respect, an advantage. But the lore's argument is that this advantage is not worth the cost. That the warrior who loves nothing ultimately fights for nothing. And the war in the 41st Millennium is ultimately about something. The survival of humanity. The preservation of possibility. The stubborn, costly, perhaps futile insistence that the specific texture of human life, not humanity as an abstraction, but humanity as the particular faces and voices and histories and individual mortal lives that constitute it, is worth defending. You cannot fight for that if you have forgotten what it feels like to actually value a specific individual human life. You can kill for it. You can die for it. But you cannot fight for it, in the full sense of choosing to bear the cost every day, because the thing you are protecting is worth the cost, unless you carry within yourself a living example of what it is you are protecting. Love is not incidental to the mission of the Adeptus Astartes. For all the program's efforts to remove it, love is the reason the mission matters. The conditioning tried to make weapons. The love that kept coming back made them warriors. There is a difference, and the lore knows what the difference is. Part 9. The quiet ones. Moments that almost go unnoticed. There are moments in the lore that never got their own novels, never received chapter-length treatment, but carry the same weight in miniature. These are worth pausing on, because they demonstrate how widespread the pattern is once you start looking for it. There is the matter of space marine chapter serfs and thralls. The ordinary humans who serve within chapter monasteries, who maintain the armor and tend the equipment and provide the logistical foundation without which even the most powerful military organization could not function. These people live in close proximity to Astartes for decades or centuries. The lore gives us occasional glimpses of how these relationships work, and what they show is not always the cold institutional distance that a naive reading of Astartes' conditioning might suggest. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Spear of the Emperor follows the story of a chapter thrall, and through her perspective we see Space Marines as they appear to someone who knows them intimately without being one of them. What emerges from this perspective is not the monolithic invincibility that outside observers experience. It is something more interesting. Beings of extraordinary power who have, despite everything, developed specific preferences and specific dislikes and specific attachments to specific people, who notice when a familiar face is absent, who have, in some cases, spent so many years in the company of particular thralls that a relationship has formed that neither the Astartes nor the human has adequate vocabulary for, but both clearly experience as meaningful. The mental legion Marine in that story, for all his austerity and his chapter's particularly rigid orthodoxy about the proper distance between Astartes and ordinary humanity, carries something like fondness for the perspective character Anuradha. Not fondness he would name or act on in any way that would disturb the institutional surface of their interaction, but visible to the reader, present in the texture of how he responds to her, in what he is willing to say to her that he would not say to anyone else. This is the thing that happens in the margins, in the institutional cracks, in the space between what the conditioning requires and what the organic reality of sustained proximity produces. The Space Wolves' relationship with their Fenrisian wolves, the great canine companions who accompany some warriors into battle, is another example worth noting, though different in character. The bond between a space wolf and his wolf companion is documented in the lore as something genuine and mutual, not a master-pet relationship, but something more equal, forged in the dangerous conditions of Fenris and maintained through campaigns across the galaxy. When Ragnar's wolves Svangir and Ulfgeir were killed by Gaz-Kul, the lore treats their deaths with a weight that it does not always give to the deaths of human soldiers. Ragnar's grief is real and specific, and the kind of grief that belongs to love rather than simply to loss. He had known these specific animals as individuals. Their absence was not the absence of an asset. It was the absence of them, specifically, irreplaceably. This matters because it demonstrates again that the conditioning has a ceiling. There is a level of sustained, specific attachment that the Astartes program cannot prevent from developing, not because the program failed, but because it is in the nature of any sufficiently complex consciousness to form attachments to the specific things around it. The program can redirect, delay, attenuate. It cannot permanently prevent. Given enough time and enough proximity to another being who is specific and individual and real, the same organic mechanisms that make any sufficiently intelligent creature capable of caring will do their work regardless of what has been built around them. The lore's occasional glimpses of retired or aged chapter serfs receiving genuine respect and a kind of institutional honoring from the warriors they served are another version of this. The space of a lifetime spent in shared purpose is not nothing. The chapters that acknowledge this, the salamanders most clearly, but others in smaller ways, produce warriors who are richer in their understanding of what they are fighting for, more capable of the full range of military and protective functions, less likely to drift toward the cold instrumentality that can, in its most extreme expressions, slide toward the kind of atrocity that the Astartes program was supposed to prevent. There is also the matter of what happens to Space Marines who fall, not to chaos corruption, but to the simpler human damage of isolation and loss. The lore has characters like Mephiston of the Blood Angels, who overcame the Black Rage through a process that left him changed in ways that are still not fully understood, harder, stranger, possessed of psychic power, that he should not have had, but also of a quiet that may be either transcendence or a deeper kind of loss. There are chapters reduced to a single survivor, a lone marine carrying the gene seed of his entire brotherhood, with no one left who knew any of his brothers' names. The psychological portraits of these characters, in the best of the Black Library writing, take seriously the question of what sustained isolation does to a being who was built for brotherhood. The answer is something terrible and slow. Love and belonging are not separable from each other in the way that the Astartes program assumes they can be. You cannot engineer out the need for specific connection and leave a fully functional warrior behind. What you get instead is something that functions but is not quite whole, something that does its job with mechanical competence and without the depth that comes from having a specific someone who makes the job worth doing. The Astartes, who maintain those connections, Anna's memory in Ragnar's deepest architecture, Mercedes' face in the organic layers of Loken's mind, the specific families on Nocturne that every salamander carries, are not compromised warriors. They are, in the fullest and most interesting sense of the concept, complete ones. The love does not make them weaker. It makes them specific. And in a universe as vast and as old and as indifferent as the 41st millenniums, being specific, being someone who matters to a particular other person, who carries particular others in the structure of who you are, is one of the few forms of resistance to the void that actually persists. Part 10. The answer to the question. So, can a space marine fall in love? The Saddahaun answer is yes. The answer is a qualified, complicated, sometimes tragic yes that the lore gives us across decades of accumulated story, and what the answer tells us is more interesting than the question. A space marine can fall in love before the transformation, and the transformation cannot fully erase it. Ragnar Blackmane lost everything the night the Grimskulls came, but he did not lose Anna. She became buried, unreachable in the normal course of his existence, but alive enough that an enemy could find her and use her as a weapon a decade later. The love was still there. The conditioning built around it rather than through it. A space marine can form something that has all the essential qualities of love across the impossible distance between post-human and mortal. Garviel Loken and Masadi Olaton never crossed lines that their respective natures would not allow them to cross. But what grew between them in the armory of the vengeful spirit, in the conversations that went too long, and the silences that said what the words did not, was love in the form that matters. The recognition of one specific person as irreplaceable, the grief that comes from losing them, the fact of their continued existence in your memory as a distinct and valued presence rather than a statistic. An entire chapter can be built around love as a founding principle, can make the specific care for humanity, not abstract humanity, but the actual, named, individual, mortal, grievable humans of one particular volcanic world, the organizing doctrine of everything they do, and can produce through that choice some of the finest warriors in the Imperium. The salamanders are not in spite of their love, they are because of it. And love can be encoded in gene seed, can be transmitted across 10,000 years, and 1 billion individual warriors, can become a genetic inheritance that costs its bearers dearly, but also gives them something that no amount of conditioning can replicate: the capacity for genuine passion, for art that is not merely decorative, for commitment that goes below the institutional and into the specific and irreducible. The Blood Angels suffer for it. They suffer enormously and continuously, and with a kind of grandeur that the setting reserves for tragedy at its most complete. But they are also, in their best moments, the most fully alive of all the Astartes, the most capable of beauty, the most capable of sacrifice that costs something real, because it is for someone specific. The Astartes program tried to make perfect weapons. What it made instead were imperfect people, strange and vast and alien in many ways, but connected to the human world they came from by threads that could be stretched and attenuated and buried under decades of war, but never quite cut. The love those threads represent is not a failure of the program. It is evidence that the program was working on material too fundamentally human to be fully transformed. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods and the endless grinding noise of a civilization trying to survive against impossible odds, that seems worth knowing. The capacity to love something specific, to hold it as irreplaceable even when the universe insists that everything is expendable, to carry a name or a face or the memory of a face in the deepest layer of yourself, where nothing else can reach. This is the thing that the 41st millennium cannot take from its warriors. Not all of them, not completely, not permanently. It is the thing that makes them worth writing stories about. It is the thing that makes those stories worth reading. Part 11. Threads that run through the darkness. When we sit with these stories as a whole, there is a particular quality to the way love manifests in this setting that is worth naming. It tends not to happen in moments of peace or comfort, because 40K does not really have peace or comfort in any sustained way. It tends to happen in the margins of conflict, in the brief intervals between campaigns, in the specific intimacy that shared danger creates between people who are watching out for each other. This is not accidental. The conditions that produce love in the 40,000 setting are the conditions that the setting creates in abundance. People thrown together against circumstances larger than any of them individually, needing each other in ways that strip away the polite social distance that ordinary life maintains. When Ragnar was serving in the Wolfblade on Holy Terror, he was out of his element, in a world he did not understand, relying on Gabriella's expertise to navigate situations that his battlefield training had not prepared him for. The vulnerability of that situation, of being the strongest person in the room and still being dependent on someone else's knowledge, produced conditions under which something genuine could develop. When Loken was in his armory, he was in one of the few places where he was off duty in any meaningful sense. The conversations he had there happened in a space that was not quite the military world, not quite the institutional context that governed everything else aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Mercedes' presence in that space was an interruption of his normal categories that the normal categories could not quite metabolize. She was not a soldier, not a serf, not a fellow Astartes. She was someone who had decided he was interesting enough to keep coming back to, which was, by the standards of the world Loken inhabited, a genuinely unusual experience. The conditions for love in the 40K setting are, in this sense, almost classically tragic. They arise in windows that will close. They develop between people who cannot stay together. They produce connections that will be severed by the nature of what one or both parties is, by the war that is always waiting outside the armory door, by the fact that mortals age and die while Astartes do not, or by the specific and particular cruelties of a universe that does not negotiate with hope. But they arise, despite everything, despite the conditioning and the gene seed and the 10,000 years of institutional momentum directed at preventing exactly this kind of thing. They arise because consciousness, even consciousness as radically altered as a Space Marine's, will, given sufficient time and sufficient proximity to another specific consciousness, find itself forming attachments that exceed the categories available for them. This persistence, this capacity to happen anyway, is what makes love in the 40K setting a more radical statement than it might initially appear. In a setting defined by the argument that everything can be weaponized, or exploited, or destroyed, the small moments we have been tracing represent a counter-argument, that some things in conscious life are more fundamental than the systems built around them, that the bond between two specific people, built out, of attention and time and the specific knowledge of each other's particularity, represents something that institutional power cannot fully reach. The Imperium of man is not sympathetic to this counter-argument. It would prefer its weapons to be weapons without remainder. The fact that they are not, that even the most thoroughly engineered killing machines in human history retain the capacity to notice someone specific and be changed by the noticing, is the Imperium's great ongoing problem and, for the reader, its great ongoing grace. We come to these stories looking for the lore, for the detailed knowledge of a universe we love. But we stay with them because the universe keeps doing this, keeps producing these moments of impossible specific connection in the least hospitable terrain imaginable. And every time it happens, it says something true about what it is to be conscious and alive. Ragnar Blackmane stood at the coming-of-age festival with the girl named Anna and felt something he did not have words for, and whatever it was, it survived everything the universe threw at it, and a demon reached down into his history and found it still burning, years later. Garviel Loken sat in an armory with a woman who remembered everything, and she asked him what he felt, and he answered, and the answering changed both of them. The salamanders go home to Nocturne and stand among the graves of families they have outlived, and they do not stop going home because the specific weight of specific love for specific people is the foundation on which everything else they are is built. The blood angels carry a Primarch's grief in their blood, 10,000 years on, and they paint and they sculpt and they fight with a passion that all the other chapters recognize as different without being able to fully name why, and the why is this. They never stopped feeling what was done to the person they loved. These are war stories. They are stories about the worst conflict imaginable, about the grinding horror of a galaxy in permanent crisis, about beings designed for violence in a universe that needs them to be. But underneath all of that, at the level where the lore is most honest about what it is and what it means, they are love stories. Stories about what it costs to love in conditions designed to make love impossible, and about why the cost keeps getting paid anyway. The answer, when it comes, is never clean. The love in 40K does not resolve the way love resolves in settings designed to be more hospitable to it. Ragnar did not go back to Fenris and forget Gabriella cleanly, and Anna does not get a moment of peace or completion anywhere in the narrative. Loken and Masadi do not get a reunion that undoes the years of horror between Istvan and the Siege of Terror. The salamanders watch their families age and die and go back to do it again. The blood angels carry their Primarch's grief whether they want to or not. None of it resolves. None of it is supposed to. What the lore offers instead of resolution is witness. The confirmation that it happened, that it was real, that the feeling was genuine and specific and not reducible to conditioning, or mission parameter, or institutional function. The stories do not promise that love will save anyone, or that it will last, or that its existence will be recognized or rewarded by a universe that is largely indifferent to such things. They only promise that it was there, that it is still there, somewhere, in the deep architecture of beings who were made to be weapons and could not stop being people. That, in the grim darkness of the far future, seems like enough. Closing. We have come a long way together tonight. We started with a question that seems almost absurd on its face. Can a space marine fall in love? And ended up somewhere much more interesting. Not just with the answer, which is yes, but with what the answer reveals about the 40,000 setting, and about the choices that the best writers in this universe have made about what they want the setting to say. It says that the capacity for specific, personal, irreplaceable love is one of the things that survives, that no amount of engineering or indoctrination or gene seed manipulation can reach all the way down to the organic core of what a conscious being does when it is left alone with another conscious being for long enough, that the Astartes program, for all its thoroughness and brilliance, and the terrifying efficiency with which it produces warriors, was working with material that retained something untransformable. And it says that this untransformable remainder is not a flaw. It is not a vulnerability to be remedied in future editions of the program. It is the thing that makes the warriors fight for something real, that gives them a home that is not just a set of coordinates, but a specific person or a specific people whose survival means something that transcends mission parameters. If you have never thought about 40,000 in these terms before, I hope this video gives you new things to look for when you read the lore, or play the games, or paint the miniatures. The love is there, if you know how to look for it. Quiet, compressed, shaped strange by the conditions of its existence, but unmistakably real. I also want to say, because this is the kind of topic that deserves it, that the best thing 40K lore does in the moments we have been looking at tonight is take the feeling seriously. It does not mock Ragnar for caring about Anna. It does not treat Loken's feelings for Mercedes as an embarrassing deviation from the correct Astartes template. It does not present the Salamander's love for the people of Nocturne as a weakness that costs them on the battlefield. It takes these things at the weight they deserve, which is the full weight of love as it actually functions in conscious life. Serious, costly, fragile, persistent, and worth the cost. In a setting that is so thoroughly defined by the argument that everything can be weaponized or made useful or discarded if it cannot be made useful, the insistence on treating love as a real thing that has real weight and demands to be taken seriously is itself a kind of political act. It is the fiction saying, no, not this. This is not a mission parameter. This is not a strategic asset or a liability to be managed. This is a person. This person matters. The feeling is real, and the loss would be real, and the protection they deserve is not calculated from efficiency metrics, but from the irreducible fact of their specific existence. That is Warhammer 40,000 in one of its truest expressions, the most brutal universe imaginable, and love happening in it anyway. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If this video gave you something to think about, if it showed you a corner of the lore you had not looked at before, if it made you reach for one of the novels we discussed, or made you look at your Space Wolves differently, or made you want to know more about the Salamanders or the Blood Angels, please give it a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think, and it tells me what kind of content you want to see more of. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button. There is so much more lore to explore. So many more corners of this universe to sit with together. So many more questions that seem strange on the surface and turn out to lead somewhere interesting underneath. I want to keep taking those journeys with you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, sleep well, and remember, even in the grim darkness of the far future, something endures.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.